You're in a room full of people. Everyone's talking. Everyone's trying to be heard. There's that guy in the corner who keeps interrupting, making sure his voice is the loudest. There's the woman who laughs too hard at her own jokes, scanning the room to see who's watching. And then there's someone else. Someone sitting slightly apart. They haven't said a word in 20 minutes. They're not fidgeting. They're not checking their phone. They're just watching. And here's what you don't realize until much later. Maybe not until you're driving home replaying the night in your head. That quiet person? They learned more about everyone in that room in 20 minutes than the loud ones will learn in 20 years. And if they wanted to, they could use it. Carl Jung understood something about silence that most people never will. The person who speaks least often controls the most. Not because silence is mystical. Not because quiet people are smarter. But because in a world where everyone is desperate to be seen, the person who refuses to perform becomes impossible to read. And what you cannot read, you cannot manipulate. What you cannot predict, you cannot defeat. Jung spent his career studying the parts of the mind people avoid, the shadow, the unconscious, the drives that make you do things you claim you'd never do. And he noticed something repeatedly. The people who talked the most understood themselves the least. They were using words as a wall, a defense, a way to avoid the silence where self-knowledge begins. Most people are afraid of silence because it forces them to face themselves. And most people cannot stand who they find there. So they talk, they fill every gap. They narrate their lives out loud because the alternative is sitting with a stranger inside their own mind. Jung called this stranger the shadow, the part of you you've rejected, the part that holds your rage, your envy, your forbidden desires. When you're constantly talking, you never have to meet it. Quiet people already have, and that's why their silence feels different. It's not empty. It's resolved. Here's your first lesson. Talking is spending. Every word costs you something. It costs you information. It costs you mystery. It costs you flexibility. Most people spend words like a drunk spends money. No strategy, no awareness, just constant output. Quiet people treat words like currency. They spend only when there's a return. When they finally speak, people listen. Not because they're more interesting, but because scarcity creates value. The person who talks constantly has devalued themselves. The person who speaks rarely has increased their perceived weight. Jung called this psychic energy. Your mind has a limited supply, and you choose where it goes. Most people direct it outward, performing, managing impressions, monitoring how they're perceived. It's exhausting, and it traps you. The more energy you spend externally, the less you have for internal development. Quiet people reverse this. They direct energy inward, observing, questioning, building internal structure. That's why they seem stable, grounded, and hard to shake. They aren't stronger. They've just been building something you're ignoring. When you stop talking so much, the first thing you'll feel is discomfort. You'll feel invisible. You'll feel like you're losing ground. You'll want to jump in and compete for attention. Don't. That discomfort is the threshold. Because what comes next is power. People start wondering about you. They can't categorize you. They don't know your opinions. They don't know your weaknesses. You become a question mark in a room full of exclamation points, and questions are always more compelling than answers. Jung called the deeper process individuation. becoming who you actually are beneath roles and expectations. Most people never do it. They become their job, their identity, their persona. Individuation requires silence because it requires listening to yourself without performance. You can't hear yourself if you're always speaking. Quiet people have started that process, and that's why they need less validation. They're building something internal. Here's something you weren't taught. Information asymmetry is power. The person with more information always has the advantage. When you talk, you give information. When you listen, you collect it. The quiet person is constantly gathering data, learning insecurities, patterns, reactions, while revealing almost nothing. Most people do the opposite. They hand over everything. The quiet person keeps theirs locked. Jung described the persona as the mask you present to the world. Everyone has one, but most people become it. They wear it so long they forget there's something underneath. Quiet people don't lose that separation. Because they're not constantly performing, they retain access to themselves. They can wear the mask when needed and remove it when they're alone. That flexibility is power. Every wisdom tradition emphasizes silence for a reason. Silence is where self-knowledge lives. Talking is always partially performance. Even honesty is curated, selected, framed. Only in silence do you encounter yourself without filters. Consider a negotiation. One person talks constantly, explaining and justifying. The other listens, pauses, and lets silence stretch. The advantage always belongs to the listener. The talker reveals everything. The listener reveals nothing. When the listener acts, it's informed. When the talker responds, it's blind. This dynamic plays out everywhere. Jung understood the unconscious doesn't speak in words. It communicates through images, feelings, intuition. If you're constantly talking, you drown it out. Quiet people hear it. That's why their instincts seem sharper. Not because they're special, but because they're listening. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of what you say doesn't matter. It's filler. A reaction to silence, not meaning. Quiet people accept that most moments don't require commentary. Speech becomes a tool, not a reflex. Jung's idea of introversion wasn't about shyness. It was about energy direction, inward or outward. Quiet people protect their energy and structure their lives around it. They stop fighting their nature and start working with it. Beneath your personal unconscious is something deeper. Patterns shared across humanity. You don't access that through noise. You access it through silence. Quiet people go deeper by default. Now let's address something important. Some of you are quiet because you're afraid. That's not power. That's avoidance. Strategic silence comes from strength, from choice. If you can't speak, your silence isn't power. It's constraint. Jung described how extremes flip. The loud collapse into silence. The controlled explode into chaos. Balance is power. Not constant silence, not constant speech, but the ability to choose. Quiet people aren't empty. They're full of observation and processing. When they sit quietly, they're working. No one sees it. No one interrupts it. By the time they act, they're already ahead. You've seen this play out. The loud person pushes early. The quiet person waits, then moves once and wins. Not because they're better, but because they understood timing. People project onto silence. When you don't define yourself, others do it for you. And they usually project something more powerful than reality. silence becomes a mirror. Jung saw transformation as something that requires containment. Silence is that container. When you constantly talk, you release the pressure before anything changes. Quiet people hold it. They let transformation complete before revealing anything. Quiet people are often better communicators for this reason. They learn precision. They say in one sentence what others need 10 for. Every word carries weight. Real power is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to prove itself. It acts when necessary. The loud display of power is often compensation. The quiet one is usually the one in control. Jung understood the ego isn't in control. The unconscious is. Most people are being driven by forces they don't understand. Quiet people develop a relationship with those forces. They listen instead of resisting. In conflict, the person who speaks first often loses. They reveal their position. They show their cards. The person who waits gathers information first. Silence creates pressure, and most people break under it. Quiet people understand rhythm, engagement, and withdrawal. They know the real work happens in private. The world rewards visibility, but visibility is built in silence. In relationships, the person who needs it less has more power. Quiet people develop an internal life that reduces desperation. That gives them leverage. Jung described the self as the totality of the psyche. Most people never reach it because they're too attached to their surface identity. Quiet people, through internal attention, get closer to it. That creates stability. You don't need to become someone else. You just need to become aware of how you use speech. Notice when you're talking to say something meaningful and when you're talking to avoid silence. The quiet person doesn't win because silence is magic. They win because silence is discipline. The discipline to observe, to wait, to gather information, and to act only when it matters. That discipline is available to anyone. It just requires sitting in discomfort long enough for it to turn into something else. Carl Jung spent his life exploring the depths most people avoid, and what he found again and again was simple. The answers you're looking for aren't in the noise. They're in the silence you've been avoiding.